do it. Joseph Farrell is back with us for another fascinating and unexpected journey into the edge, really. Joseph has been with us on Dreamland many times for talking about the Reich of the Black Sun, the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, Secrets of the Unified Field. We've talked to Joseph many times, and subscribers, you can listen to all of Joseph's past interviews, among the most popular on Unknown Country in the subscriber section. They are all collected there under Dreamland and or special interviews. Later, for subscribers, Jim Mars and Joseph Farrell are going to be talking together. This time, we're talking about Roswell and the Third Reich, the Nazi connection. No one has ever proved that definitively that the spacecraft or craft that was found at Roswell came from another world. I had the experience of listening to my own uncle talk about his attempts to work on this debris at Wright Field, and General Arthur Exon, who was the commandant of Wright Field for many years, also told me things that that led to the publication of my book, Majestic. And General Exon said to me, within 24 hours of our finding it, everyone from Truman on down knew that what we found was not of this world. But is that really true? Well, Joseph Farrell has perhaps a different idea. Joseph, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me back, Whitley.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you, and you have a remarkably different take on the whole scenario. Tell us exactly what you think we are dealing with here with the Roswell incident.
Well, in a nutshell, Whitley, my scenario is that what crashed at Roswell, in all likelihood, was a representative of some aspect of an ongoing post-war Nazi research project, most likely conducted in Latin America somewhere, and that we can explain the military's panic reaction, so to speak, to that event. And I definitely think that there was a considerable degree of panic involved, that we can rationalize that panic not by having to appeal to extraterrestrials, but to the sudden realization on the part of our military that there was a group of Nazis out there somewhere in the world that was continuing a lot of the advanced projects that they had begun in the Third Reich, and moreover, and this would account for the panic, that moreover, that they were reconnoitering and surveilling our most sensitive defensive installations in this country and able to do so with more or less impunity. So I think the panic reaction is kind of twofold. It's due to a political realization that, in a certain sense, the war wasn't over, and in a second sense, with the realization that much of the advanced technology that we had sought in the Third Reich at the end of the war did not, in fact, make it into our hands, but remained in their hands. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Well, we're going to talk later about the possible implications of this, which are obviously fairly huge, in the sense that if there was a Nazi survival that had advanced technology, what kind of power may they have now? We've discussed that in the past with Joseph, and that's where we're going to go toward the end of the show. But right now, let me ask you this. You have produced this quite fascinating book, Roswell and the Reich, the Nazi connection, and you have really gone against the core beliefs of the entire UFO community, including, quite frankly, your host. So give us some idea here. We have a thing that arrives 30 miles from the 509th Bomb Wing. And obviously, it's the most sensitive military establishment in the American arsenal and probably on Earth, in that the only operational atomic bombs in the world are supposedly stored there. And able to to be delivered to Russia via bombers that are there, and Stalin has got 4.5 million soldiers sitting on the Iron Curtain, ready to sweep across Europe to the English Channel. The only thing stopping him is those bombs. So, yeah, it's a very sensitive place.
Right.
Now, General Exon said to me, and I quote, "Not of this world." Those were his exact words were, everyone from Truman on down knew that this thing was not of this world. What we'd found was not of this world within 24 hours of our finding it. What would be his motive for misinforming me?
Well, maybe he didn't. One of the things, Whitley, that I encountered in researching this book was over and over, the people in the military are using language, I think, that is deliberately and very precisely crafted so that it can be taken in two senses. Not of this world has traditionally been interpreted by the ufology community to mean precisely extraterrestrial. In other words, that the technology that was recovered at Roswell originated off this planet. But I think you can interpret the statement in a very different way, and I do this with a lot of the documents, as you know, that I put in the book, that might mean simply not of this particular culture. In other words, this particular cultural world. This kind of language I run into over and over again. So I think there exists a possibility, given the scenario that I outline in the book, that we have to go back and look at a lot of these statements and see if perhaps there are words or phrases that can be taken in a very different sense. That at least would be my reaction to it.
So let's now take another tack, and let's look at, you mentioned that this thing might have been originated, the technology might have originated off this world. Could you tell us a little bit about what draws you to that thought?
Well, I didn't mean to imply that I believe that the craft that crashed at Roswell and the technology that it represented originated off this world. I didn't mean to imply that. I meant simply to imply that General Exon's statement has been taken to mean that in the ufology community, but I think it's capable of a very different type of interpretation. And again, the ambiguity of the language, I think, permits that to a certain extent. But there are people that I've encountered, Whitley, in the ufology community since I started kind of outlining this Nazi scenario in earlier books and then finally writing it up in this one, that persistently ask me whether or not it was possible for the Nazis to have recovered their own version of Roswell circa 1933 to 36, the famous Black Forest incident that you hear about on the Internet quite a bit.
Tell us a little bit about it, will you? Because maybe we didn't hear.
Well, there have been rumors that there was something that crashed in the Black Forest, and in some versions of the story, in the Hartz Mountains or in Bavaria somewhere, which would be, of course, in the Black Forest. The problem I have always had, Whitley, that this rumor has circulated so widely, is that, number one, it doesn't seem to be very well substantiated. And number two, we simply do not need that as an explanation for the Nazi advances in technology during World War II. The simple reason being that most of what they're doing can be rationalized on the basis of terrestrial physics and engineering papers that appear between the wars, and also to a great deal of occult influence. So I tend to discount any idea of Nazi-back engineering, of a Nazi Roswell, in other words, with, Nazi versions of Colonel Corso back engineering everything. I tend to discount that simply because it's an unneeded hypothesis to explain what's going on. So I don't mean to imply that I think the technology originated off-world. There is, however, one significant story, and I mentioned that story in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, that it is claimed by a group of post-war neo-Nazis originating around the circle of Jan van Helsing that the Vril Society, shortly after World War I, used a medium to channel information and gain a lot of its technology that way. I have not been able to corroborate that story from any other source other than that. So again, my inclination, I mentioned it in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, but my inclination is to dismiss these types of explanations and to search for purely and explicitly terrestrial explanations.
You say in your book, so pervasive is this inane music, referring to the UFO community's belief that the Roswell craft was extraterrestrial, that few people seem to notice its hidden sociological and psychological impact within that community, namely, that as an explanation it serves to disincline people to look for and construct speculative terrestrial explanations.
Right.
Now, in other words, could it be that someone is intentionally hiding a terrestrial reality behind an extraterrestrial explanation?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And in fact, I'm glad you asked that question because it's a very profound question, I think, particularly with regard to this case, in that I also mention in Roswell and the Reich what I call the Roswell dialectic. And this is a dialectic of interpretive contexts that run between two poles, but there's no middle alternative. And that dialectic is on the one hand, the extraterrestrial explanation, which of course most of the famous big names in Roswell research maintain. And then on the other side of the pole, you have the idea of a purely mundane explanation, like weather balloons or mogul balloons and things of this sort. And what this dialectic does, it emerges on the very day that the Army announces it's recovered a flying saucer, and then mere hours later changes its story. Oh no, we were, the intelligence officer of the only atomic bomb group in the entire world made a big mistake and misidentified a common weather balloon. Well, this is, to my mind, Whitley, the clear indication that we have a surface kind of cover story being the weather balloon, and then a deeper cover story, as you allude in your questions, being the cover story that this was something extraterrestrial. What they don't want people looking at is the possibility of a terrestrial explanation, because at that time, the only nation on the face of the earth that had investigated that type of technology to the degree that the crash represented was precisely Nazi Germany. So people looking in that direction, of course, may have discovered the political fact that there was something of Nazism that survived as an organized entity able to conduct that research independently of any of the victorious powers of World War II. That's the big, in my opinion, that they wanted to cover up.
Well, there's recently been a book out, just came out, I'm just starting to read it, about the number of Nazis who escaped after the war and the amount of money they took with them. Gold, which was extraordinary. And we're going to be talking more about the implications of this, because I think that Joseph is suggesting that there is a hidden superpower on this planet to this day. We'll be right back.
Could the world really end? If it happens, is there a plan for us? Read Whitley Strieber's new book, The Omega Point. As the world collapses around them, a desperate band of carefully chosen people discover the secret history of modern times and the fantastic promise our future holds in this most dangerous era in all history. The Omega Point. What happens at the end of time? In bookstores now. Get your copy now.
We're talking to Joseph Farrell, his new book, Roswell and the Reich, The Nazi Connection. Joseph has been with us on Dreamland many times, and subscribers, you can go to the subscriber section, click on the audio archive, click on the Dreamland archive or the special interviews archive, and you will find many instances of interviews with Joseph Farrell, always fascinating. A very extraordinary researcher who really marches to a different drummer. And Joseph, where can we find you online?
I have a website that's called www.gizadeathstar.com. That's all one word, all lowercase. And then if you go to that website, they can find a button on there that says contact, and they can email me directly. I would ask that if anyone does email me that they put all capitals in the subject header, because I get an enormous amount of email, and that kind of helps me open up the emails. That's my signal that I use to know that I have to open the email and respond to something. But that's basically where they can find me.
Okay, good. Now, let's return to Roswell in 1947, 5 days prior to the actual incident. There was something that's come to be known as the Wilmot sighting after the person who reported it. Could you tell us a little bit about this sighting, and also we'll get into its significance for your argument, which is there.
Well, the Wilmots were a couple that lived in Roswell, and they reported seeing a disc-shaped object flying close to their house. They saw it for a few seconds, and one of the Wilmots, Mrs. Wilmot, described it as making kind of a swishing sound, kind of a hissing sound as it flew through the air. Mr. Wilmot did not describe any sound associated with it, but he guessed that the speed was approximately 400 miles an hour. Now, the story itself connects to Roswell in the following way, because the Roswell Daily Record ran the report of their sighting on the very day that it ran the report, the famous report, of course, that the U.S. Army Air Force had recovered this flying saucer. Now, the interesting thing, Whitley, is that there's really nothing logically to connect the Wilmot sighting to the Roswell event itself, other than the fact that the story ran in the Roswell Daily Record. The interesting thing to me is the speed of the craft being reported as 400 miles an hour, and the sound. Of course, the Wilmots living in Roswell would have been familiar with the noise of B-29s taking off from the air base there.
Right.
And, 400 miles an hour, that, to my mind, Whitley, that's just not a sufficient speed for an extraterrestrial craft. That's my basic point. And over and over again, you find UFO reports from that era that mention various speeds, none of them really sufficient in terms of the physics or the signature or the speed of the objects to be sufficient really for any sort of extraterrestrial craft.
But of course, in terms of terrestrial craft, it was at the outside edge of the envelope of the possible speeds of known craft. But at that time, jet engines made an absolutely deafening noise.
Yes, that's also
I don't
true.
think there were many pistons. There were a few. I mean, the P-51 Mustang and a few other World War II era fighters could reach speeds like that, but not without making a lot of noise, especially if they weren't particularly high altitude. And this swishing sound implies a completely different technology of propulsion.
Right, exactly. And that too is my point, that we are dealing here with something that is not, on the one hand, all that unusual in terms of its speed. It's certainly insufficient for an extraterrestrial craft, but on the other, the signature, the low noise that it makes, Mr. Wilmot didn't even report any noise associated with the craft, as I recall. So we are dealing with a very different kind of technology. And again, if you tie or to connect the dots that I outline in the book, that sort of technology would have been something that the Germans were working on during World War II, suctioning the boundary layer and constructing jet turbine type saucers and so on and so forth. So yes, that's a definite component of my argument.
Now I want to range around here, and I won't lose you, but I might talk about some incidents that you're unfamiliar with, or maybe not. I don't know. In 1946 in Sweden, there was something called the ghost rocket phenomenon, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Oh, yes.
These rockets that appeared, and they even found bits of debris on the coasts, and they produced radar returns. There was absolutely no question that these things existed. They were real.
Right.
Now, what you may not know is that a ghost rocket was photographed off the coast of Newfoundland a couple of weeks ago. and it was radar tracked and extensively analyzed by the Canadian authorities, and they concluded that it wasn't a missile, it wasn't a model rocket, it wasn't, in fact, anything that they could identify. It came up out of the ocean and crossed northern Newfoundland, and a very clear photograph of it was taken. It's a rocket with a contrail. Now, if you read Dr. Paul Hill's Unconventional Flying Objects, and listeners, Paul was an extraordinarily famous NASA engineer and a very honored man who had some incredible UFO sightings in his lifetime and wrote a book about them that he intended to publish after his retirement, but then the manuscript was found in his personal effects. They wouldn't even let him publish it during his lifetime, and his daughter published it. Among those is a description of an object he saw along the Carolina coast, I believe, or in that tier of states. I guess it was a little farther north than that. It was in Virginia, which it was a cylindrical object spewing smoke. Now, I think you're looking at the same technology in all three cases. One is recent as just a few weeks ago. The other, as the oldest, as long ago as 1946. Different from the Roswell technology. But I want your reaction to this, because I think you might have something to say about what we might be seeing here.
Well, Whitley, my reaction initially, I'm not familiar with the Canada case, which is very fascinating the way you've outlined it. I am familiar with Paul Hill. I read his book many, many years ago. And, of course, the ghost rockets I mentioned in Roswell and the Reich and again in Reich of the Black Sun. I do think from the descriptions that we're dealing with, again, we're not dealing with a technology that, to my mind, is sufficiently compelling to the conclusion that it must be extraterrestrial. I think we're dealing with some sort of hidden terrestrial technology that's been developed over the years. That would be my initial reaction. As to who's developing it, that could be anybody's guess. My own inclination would be to assume that if we posit the existence of a post-war Nazi organization that has very deep financial pockets, and it certainly does, that it is continuing some of this research on its own. That's one possibility, and certainly another would be any of the black projects of the various great powers of the world.
Now, you say it has deep pockets, and that interests me a lot, because I'm also wondering about its conceivable power in our world. Yes. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I certainly have, that presidents no longer appear to be independent. They all seem to be following the same ideology and doing essentially the same things, no matter who they are, who they say they are. And I've been wondering for a while if there wasn't something hidden behind that.
Well, I definitely think so. I think at the minimum, Whitley, we have to look to two possibilities. Of course, Jim's idea of the Fourth Reich, kind of a penetration of fascist ideology into Anglo-American culture, would certainly account for it. And certainly we know by this point that the Anglo-American corporate elite has very deep pockets, and they have been very, very influential in the election, or rather one might say the selection of presidents over the past few decades. So I would have no quibble with that. I think the other possibility we must look at is, again, the possibility that there is some independent sort of fascist organization afoot in the world that really does not have a territory that it claims as its own. It's kind of an extraterritorial state, as it were. And it would certainly have its tentacles into the American elite, into the European elite, and so on and so forth. And certainly with the deep pockets, the vast amount of money that the Nazis escaped from Europe with, it would certainly be an influence in American politics. And I kind of follow Jim's line here, Whitley, that we're looking at such an expansion of fascist ideology in this country, in our culture, that we have to open the door at least to the possibility that this is one of the things we might be dealing with.
Well, you're going to be talking to Jim Mars
Right.
for our subscribers in a few minutes, and I'm going to be listening with absolute attention because I think that the confluence of Joseph Farrell and Jim Mars is, to say the least, absolutely fascinating. Now, let's get back to the technology.
Sure.
I was sort of circling around the technology a little bit with the three incidents I mentioned, because, and by the way, folks, if you're interested in the ghost rocket, go to unknowncountry.com, and you should be able to find it in the news by going to the search engine and clicking on ghost rocket. And if not, it is in the news, and just look in the last month's or last 2 months' news, and you'll find it. And it's the only place, by the way, in the world that the two phenomena, the 46 phenomena and the recent Newfoundland phenomena, have been compared. There's no other reporting resource on the planet that knew that. No one. Now, anyway, let's get back to this technology, because we're looking now something that can go 400 to 500 miles an hour, that is that can do that silently at a time when there was no known technology that could even come close to that, and in fact, even now, I don't think we could be that quiet.
Right. I think what you're looking at, Whitley, is some version of a German-based saucer suction technology. And one of the reasons I think that is, as I mentioned in the book, the Germans quickly concluded, as did the Americans and the British, that if they wanted to have an extremely efficient lifting body, the way to do it would be to suction the boundary layer. The boundary layer is that little molecule or 2 molecules thick little layer of air that sits more or less stationary on the wing of any aircraft. And as the aircraft goes faster, that boundary layer gradually gets pushed back and eventually creates drag and everything else. Well, those three powers were interested in suctioning the boundary layer. In other words, they were kind of after the idea of an aircraft that would slip through the air with more or less complete loss of friction. And the Germans quickly concluded that the most efficient way to do that would be to come up with a microporous metal. And they actually did come up with such a metal that would literally suck the air right through these little tiny holes in the surface of a lifting body and then eject them as part of the exhaust in a turbine-based or jet-based aircraft. I think that's what you're looking at here. How silent it would have been, it probably would have been very silent given the fact that you're sucking and pushing these things out through very, very small little pores. Now, the interesting thing to me in this, Whitley, as I mentioned in the book, is that if you look at some of the actual bona fide genuine documents that are cited within the Roswell research community, one of these documents is an intelligence collection memo from Air Force General Shogun, at the time the head of Air Force Intelligence. And he outlines a series of things in this memo. And one of the things he notes is that under extreme performance conditions, these things do make a roaring sound, a kind of a jet aircraft under high performance conditions sound. But in most cases, they're relatively silent. But he also mentions in that document the possibility of suctioning the boundary layer and vectoring the exhaust thrust. And this is precisely the type of research that the Germans were doing during the war. And to me, this is a dead giveaway of what they're really thinking the origin of this craft and the technology was, namely Nazi Germany.
We're going to take a little break. We'll be right back with Joseph Farrell. His book, Roswell and the Reich, The Nazi Connection. You can get it in any bookstore. Get it from BarnesandNoble.com, from Amazon.com, but you can certainly get it. Roswell and the Reich. We'll be right back.
Could the world really end? If it happens, is there a plan for us? Read Whitley Strieber's new book, The Omega Point. As the world collapses around them, a desperate band of carefully chosen people discover the secret history of modern times and the fantastic promise our future holds in this most dangerous era in all history. The Omega Point, What Happens at the End of Time. In bookstores now. Get your copy now.
We're talking to Joseph Farrell. His book, Roswell and the Reich, The Nazi Connection. He's going to be talking with Jim Mars for our subscribers about the extent of fascist or Nazi influence in the modern world, and I'm incredibly eager to listen to that myself. You can listen in the subscriber section to many of our interviews with this remarkably fascinating man, Joseph Farrell. His latest idea is that the Roswell Incident was not an extraterrestrial spacecraft, but that it was a high-tech Nazi craft, and that this had extraordinary repercussions. Now, I don't necessarily agree or disagree with my guests, and I don't really know, honestly, where I personally come down on this. But I do find it absolutely fascinating and a whole new look at the Roswell Incident. And since the question has never been completely answered, let's keep asking it in new ways. You can also visit Joseph online. His website is Reich of the Black Sun. Is that correct?
No, www.gizadeathstar.com.
Giza Death Star. Yeah, why can't I ever remember that? I
don't remember it myself.
Yeah. Anyway, there you are. You can reach him online at gizadeathstar.com. Now, here is a question that I have. We're talking about a technology before we left the air. A remarkable technology, a whole new means of propulsion that has been talked about in the aerospace industry for years, and has always faltered on the fact that the materials and the fans and so forth involved would be too difficult to manufacture and too ungainly. Now, this craft was working in 1947, and working well enough at least to get to Roswell, even though it did crash there. Why hasn't this technology emerged in any way? I mean, after all, our most secret spy planes of 10 years ago are now old hat, out in the public eye for the most part. Generally, we don't keep secrets that long. So why, in this case, is the secret still being kept?
Well, I think part of the explanation, Whitley, has to go to, again, what I think the scenario is. Part of the implication of it is political, namely that 2 years after the end of World War II, the U.S. military suddenly found itself confronted by the old enemy that was out there somewhere continuing this research. And, again, who knows where they've pressed that research since that time. But I think the main motivation, at least in my opinion, is that it has to be political. They don't want people looking too closely into this post-war fascist network and all of the tentacles that it's spread, not only in this country, but in other countries, Canada, Great Britain, and so on and so forth. And certainly you'd have to look at post-war Europe as well. I think there's a big political secret that they're really trying to keep in addition to a technological one. But let me address the technological one, too. I think to a certain extent we have to allow the possibility that that technology may have been so advanced, and I go into this argument in a bit more detail in the book, that it may have been so advanced that for whatever reason the military has kept it classified because it may have been gateway technology to other things. So I think that possibility is alive and well too, although that's not where I put my main cards.
Well, let us know, where do you put your main cards? I'm curious.
Well, I put my main cards on the political explanation. I think that this is really the big secret that they're trying to keep suppressed. They don't want people looking too closely at the connections of the Roswell debris and Nazi technology, because that really opens up the political Pandora's box that they don't want opened up. And
that Pandora's box he is going to be discussing with Jim Mars. And believe me, it's a big Pandora's box. Okay, now let's go on talking about the situation with the technology and with the people on the ground, because we have now in our world, every day that passes, there are dozens of UFO sightings, and a lot of them are perfectly legitimate, videotaped, extraordinarily strange sightings.
Right.
Some of them strange beyond even conception. I refer to things that appear to be organic things in the sky, even living creatures that live in the sky, just so bizarre. On Dreamland recently, we had an incredible interview with a man named Alan Lammers about some kind of a creature that lives in Indonesia on the island of Sulawesi that is causing people to disappear, and those who do return have only the vaguest memories of even what happened to them. And this has apparently been going on there for a while, and then I found out it happens in Australia too. And these are not Nazis. Something else is going on as well, or do you just disagree with that unequivocally?
No. I don't disagree with that at all. No. The thesis that I outline in Roswell and the Reich is solely confined to Roswell, and I go out of my way in the preface to that to say that I'm not philosophically opposed by any stretch of the imagination to what we would call legitimate UFO sightings. I'm certainly not philosophically opposed to the idea of extraterrestrials or anything of that sort. I just happen to think that in this specific case, we're dealing with something very different.
So now there was a significant amount of activity in Germany and in the Reich during and before the war in terms of technological development. But I have to ask about propulsion systems, because I can understand very well the technology that you outlined about how the thing would be able to move and keep aloft. But how would it be propelled without a jet engine in it? I don't understand.
Well, I do think that many of these German craft were suction-based saucers. In other words, jet turbine-based saucers. In fact, one of the things I put in Reich of the Black Sun is a patent that was taken out in this country in 1955 by a German engineer whose last name was Fleissner. You can actually go online and try and search for that patent in the U.S. Patent Archives, and you won't find it. But it's clearly there. I actually put the picture of it in the book so that people can see it. He took the patent out in 1955. He was awarded the patent 5 years later. But he did say, in his own words, that what he did in this patent was basically to reproduce work that he had done for the Nazi government at Peenemünde. So in other words, there is another project entirely going on at the big German Rocket Research Center in Nazi Germany other than rockets, and it concerns this whole business of suction-based saucers. So I do think that we're dealing with something in these reports of post-war flying saucers, that at least in some cases we're dealing with something that is based on that wartime Nazi technology.
Now, the fact that this patent is no longer present, how did you find it?
It's been uncovered. It was uncovered by a researcher that's been following this German UFO story for a number of years, an excellent researcher by the name of Henry Stevens. And he actually sent off for the patent and actually received it and, reproduced it in some of his books. That's where it comes from. If you go online now to the U.S. Patent Office and its archives and do a research for the patent number, the patent's there, but the patent won't appear on your screen. It just doesn't show up. So it's one of those stories, I think, where we have a case of perhaps a little bit of suppression, because the interesting thing about it is that at the time he filed his patent, that was the time that Project Silverbug, which was, I think, probably the real project behind the Avro saucer car up in Canada, that this was the time that Project Silverbug got underway. And the resemblance between the two projects, Fleissner's patent and Project Silverbug, is all too palpable.
And listeners, we will post the Ghost Rocket story on the Dreamland, a link to the Ghost Rocket story that I referred to earlier on Dreamland, this week's Dreamland, so you can just click on it rather than having to go through this drill of going through the search engine and so forth on Unknown Country. So you'll just be able to click the link and read that very interesting story. And the implication, of course, being that these activities, even technologically, are still being carried out. And, for example, in the Ghost Rocket situation, it was observed by the professionals who looked at this that there was something wrong with the length of the stream of exhaust out of the rocket. There was much more of a plume coming out of it than should have come out of it. The physics of it were such that it didn't look like it should even be flying, and yet it was. So are we looking now at a hidden community in this world that possesses and keeps to itself extraordinary technologies that enable them, presumably, to move around the world very freely? Now, when we get back, I'm going to ask Joseph a question about the possibility that people on Earth in possession of technologies like that might be bumping up against extraterrestrials who are here also. We'll be right back.
Could the world really end? If it happens, is there a plan for us? Read Whitley Strieber's new book, The Omega Point. As the world collapses around them, a desperate band of carefully chosen people discover the secret history of modern times and the fantastic promise our future holds in this most dangerous era in all history. The Omega Point. What happens at the end of time? In bookstores now. Get your copy now.
We're talking to Joseph Farrell. Joseph Farrell's new book, Roswell in the Reich, The Nazi Connection. His website, GizaDeathStar.com. I think I finally got that right, Joseph. After having talked to you at least 5 or 6 times on Dreamland, I never get that right. And you can listen to more of Joseph's fascinating interviews and his extraordinary lifetime exploration of hidden Nazi technology on UnknownCountry.com in the subscriber section. Also for our subscribers, Jim Mars and Joseph Farrell are going to be talking about the political implications of a Nazi survival in modern times. Now, I want to ask you, Joseph, what about if there are people with extraordinary technologies like this, are they able to leave the planet, go to other worlds? How far along might these technologies be? And I ask that because there have been implications from time to time that there might be an extensive human presence off the planet now. Mm-hmm. Is it a Nazi presence?
Oh, boy, that is an excellent question. And my answer, I would preface this way. I think if we go back, if we assume 2 things, number 1, that there was such a post-war Nazi organization, and number 2, that it had deep pockets and continued researching independently those technologies. Well, we have, in other words, 70 years, more or less, since the end of World War II, that they would have been able to do this. So I really think that we have to admit the possibility that some hidden group, as you put it, down here on Earth, has their hands on a very sophisticated technology that they are keeping to themselves. And if we admit that technology, I mean, my word, even Ben Rich is alleged to have said that we do have the technology to go to the stars when he was on his deathbed. So, you know, the head of the Skunk Works saying something like that is pretty significant. So I think we have to admit the possibility. Are some of those people Nazis? Again, I think we have to admit the possibility. And once we admit that possibility, we do have to admit the possibility that there may be a rather extensive human presence in deep space, yes.
Because Gary McKinnon, who, of course, is the so-called UFO hacker who simply entered open NASA computers. He didn't hack into anything. The computers had no firewalls and no protective software. So whether he committed a crime or not is, to my mind, an open question. I don't think he did. But in any case, he said on Dreamland, and subscribers, you can look up the interview he did also with Linda Moulton Howe in the special interview section of Unknown Country, that he had seen documents listing spacecraft and the names of their commanders who were off planet.
Yes.
Now, to me, the implications of this are gigantic, because we could be looking at a human presence and a human government that is so far beyond where we are. It might be that the Nazis took off, and they ended up representing the human race, even though they appeared to be completely destroyed. Is that possible?
Oh yes, I definitely think so. And in fact, I think what this hacker has stumbled onto is kind of the tip of the iceberg. Because my word, Whitley, what we're looking at is definitely the possibility not only of an independent post-war Nazi group, but the United States is certainly going to be pursuing this technology. The Soviet Union is certainly going to be pursuing this technology. Great Britain, France, anybody else that has an advanced technological infrastructure is probably going to be pursuing some of it. So, the sky's the limit, really, given enough money and manpower and keeping things a secret during that amount of time. So I think he's basically scratched the very tip of an iceberg of the possibility that we are staring directly in the face of not only secret technology, but secret groups and to be quite blunt, secret space programs. So yes, absolutely, I agree.
And I suspect that the reason that the United States is so doggedly pursuing this man, in spite of the fact that any rational jury, which he may or may not get, would let him off, is because of the fact that he cannot be allowed to speak in public. He literally does know too much.
Yes, exactly. I would agree wholeheartedly with that assessment. I think you're absolutely right.
Now that gets me to my next question, Joseph. If it's true that we did attain the technology to get us off this planet, are we now the client state of a malign extraterrestrial power? Because everything that seems to come from the upper reaches of human social authority and human society seems bent on very negative effects in our world. So where does it end? I don't think you're going to talk about this with Jim, so I'm going to ask you now, could it be that above this level of hidden governance, there's yet another level of extraterrestrial influence, and we're marching to their drum without even knowing it?
I think another excellent question, and I think we have two possibilities. There's the scenario that you've outlined, that there may be some hidden off-world influence that we don't know about. I think we have to hold that open as a definite possibility, yes. I think there's another possibility, and that is that as humans who possess this technology are pushing out from the Earth into deep space, that we may also be looking in the face of some sort of covert space war going on right over our heads. So, that would be my other possibility that we have to look at. And if that possibility is true, then we have to entertain, again, what you've outlined in your question. We have to entertain the possibility that these hidden groups or have malign intentions in mind as they expand outwards. So, yes, I have to agree with you and the direction of your question wholeheartedly.
One of the things that has begun to happen recently, starting in Norway, then in Russia, now in Australia, are these spiral formations that appear in the sky that are always attributed to incoming missiles and spent rockets coming in. But they've never appeared before. I mean, there was one over China about 10 years ago that was never explained. But the implication is strong that there is some kind of a battle going on somewhere. And I'll tell you another thing. I believe it was STS mission, shuttle mission STS-48, one of the
Yes.
shuttle missions. You probably know about that pulse of light that comes up past the
Yes.
shuttle. Tell us a little
Yes.
bit what your thinking is there.
Well, I think what we're dealing with, Whitley, in all honesty, with these spirals, the Norway spiral and so on and so forth, and the basic disintegration of a Russian test missile, and in STS-48, that famous space shuttle footage, I think what we're looking at, in my opinion, is somebody on Earth has possession of some very, very sophisticated directed energy technology, and they are sending messages to the various great powers of the world, Russia, the United States, and so on and so forth. I think that's definitely one of the things that's taking place. And in that space shuttle footage, I tend to think that because the physics signatures that we observe in those UFOs that are in that video are not sufficient enough to be practical as interstellar craft, but certainly sufficient enough to be practical as interplanetary craft within the solar system. I think what we're looking at is a display of some hidden terrestrial technology, and someone is sending messages by using that technology, and someone is sending messages by trying to shoot at that technology. So I think, again, we're looking at messages basically being sent by these incidents by certain hidden groups here on Earth that have possession of this type of technology.
Gosh, Joseph, every time I talk to you, this is so imagination and mind expanding. It makes me review in my own mind what my uncle and what General Exxon told me, and not to forget that these guys were absolutely loyal to the Air Force. Yes. This was their loyalty and their life. You can't imagine. My uncle was so profoundly loyal to the Air Force and to his country. They would have, if asked, said anything they were told me anything they were told to say. And I just wonder what was really behind it all, because I proceeded to produce a book that revolutionized, even though it was a novel, the public's entire concept of the Roswell Incident.
Right.
Was I the unwitting tool of this hidden power?
No, I don't think so. No,
Why not?
I don't think so.
I'm curious, because I do.
Well, again, I go back to what you cited that General Exxon told you, and I go to the ambiguity of his statement, because it is possible on the basis of his wording to take it not only in a terrestrial sense, but in the more plain meaning, in the extraterrestrial sense. So no, I don't think that there is that you were made a tool or anything of the sort. I think what we're dealing with is a phenomenon that is so complex, politically, technologically, and there's overlap, and I don't get into this, I must be honest, in Roswell and the Reich. But we are dealing with so much overlap between terrestrial technology and possible extraterrestrial technology, and we're dealing with so much overlap between political groups here on Earth that are both open and hidden. We don't really know who these generals and so on were ultimately answering to, and that's the problem. And they probably didn't either, and that's the other part of the problem.
And that part of the problem is exactly what you and Jim Mars are going to be talking about. I have to admit, I can hardly wait. This has been Dreamland. We've had a fabulous time with Joseph Farrell, as always. I disagree with him about Roswell, agree with him about Roswell, but you must agree with me about one thing. This is really, really interesting, his whole take on all of this. Roswell and the Reich, the Nazi connection, his website, GizaDeathStar.com. And remember, where I am right now is personally, so that you don't write me emails complaining that I no longer believe my own story about Roswell. I don't know if he's right or not, but I think it's absolutely fascinating and very worth entertaining. Thank you so much for being with us, Joseph.
Thank you for having me back on, Whitley. A pleasure. That we had sought in the Third Reich at the end of the war did not, in fact, make it into our hands, but remained in their hands. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Well, we're going to talk later about the possible implications of this, which are obviously fairly huge in the sense that if there was a Nazi survival that had advanced technology, what kind of power may they have now? We've discussed that in the past with Joseph, and that's where we're going to go toward the end of the show. But right now, let me ask you this. You have produced this quite fascinating book, Roswell and the Reich, the Nazi connection, and you have really gone against the core beliefs of the entire UFO community, including, quite frankly, your host. So give us some idea here. We have a thing that arrives 30 miles from the 509th Bomb Wing. And obviously, it's the most sensitive military establishment in the American arsenal and probably on Earth, in that the only operational atomic bombs in the world are supposedly stored there. Right. And able to be delivered to Russia via bombers that are there. And Stalin has got 4.5 million soldiers sitting on the Iron Curtain, ready to sweep across. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me back, Whitley.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you, and you have a remarkably different take on the whole scenario. Tell us exactly what you think we are dealing with here with the Roswell incident.
Well, in a nutshell, Whitley, my scenario is that what crashed at Roswell, in all likelihood, was a representative of some aspect of an ongoing post-war Nazi research project, most likely conducted in Latin America somewhere, and that we can explain the military's panic reaction, so to speak, to that event. And I definitely think that there was a considerable degree of panic involved, that we can rationalize that panic not by having to appeal to extraterrestrials, but to the sudden realization on the part of our military that there was a group of Nazis out there somewhere in the world that was continuing a lot of the advanced projects that they had begun in the Third Reich, and moreover, and this would account for the panic, that moreover, that they were reconnoitering and surveilling our most sensitive defensive installations in this country and able to do so with more or less impunity. So I think the panic reaction is kind of twofold. It's due to a political realization that, in a certain sense, the war wasn't over, and in a second sense, with the realization that much of the advanced technology would be my reaction to it.
So let's now take another tack, and let's look at, you mentioned that this thing might have been originated, the technology might have originated off this world. Could you tell us a little bit about what draws you to that thought?
Well, I didn't mean to imply that I believe that the craft that crashed at Roswell and the technology that it represented originated off this world. I didn't mean to imply that. I meant simply to imply that General Erickson's statement has been taken to mean that in the ufology community, but I think it's capable of a very different type of interpretation. And again, the ambiguity of the language, I think, permits that to a certain extent. But there are people that I've encountered, Whitley, in the ufology community since I started kind of outlining this Nazi scenario in earlier books and then finally writing it up in this one, that persistently ask me whether or not it was possible for the Nazis to have recovered their own version of Roswell circa 1933 to 36, the famous Black Forest incident that you hear about on the Internet quite a bit.
Tell us a little bit about it, will you? Because maybe we didn't hear.
Well, there have been rumors that there was something that crashed in the Black Forest, and in some versions of the story, in the Hartz Mountains or in Bavaria somewhere, which would be, of course, in the Black Forest. The problem I have always...
Europe to the English Channel. The only thing stopping him is those bombs. So, yeah, it's a very sensitive place.
Right.
Now, General Exon said to me, and I quote, "Not of this world." Those were his exact words were, everyone from Truman on down knew that this thing was not of this world. What we'd found was not of this world within 24 hours of our finding it. What would be his motive for misinforming me?
Well, maybe he didn't. One of the things, Whitley, that I encountered in researching this book was over and over, the people in the military are using language, I think, that is deliberately and very precisely crafted so that it can be taken in two senses. Not of this world has traditionally been interpreted by the ufology community to mean precisely extraterrestrial. In other words, that the technology that was recovered at Roswell originated off this planet. But I think you can interpret the statement in a very different way, and I do this with a lot of the documents, as you know, that I put in the book, that might mean simply not of this particular culture. In other words, this particular cultural world. This kind of language I run into over and over again. So I think there exists a possibility, given the scenario that I outline in the book, that we have to go back and look at a lot of these statements and see if perhaps there are words or phrases that can be taken in a very different sense. That at least
do it. Joseph Farrell is back with us for another fascinating and unexpected journey into the edge of the edge, really. Joseph has been with us on Dreamland many times for talking about the Reich of the Black Sun, the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, Secrets of the Unified Field. We've talked to Joseph many times, and subscribers, you can listen to all of Joseph's past interviews. Among the most popular on Unknown Country in the subscriber section, they are all collected there under Dreamland and or special interviews. Later, for subscribers, Jim Mars and Joseph Farrell are going to be talking together. This time, we're talking about Roswell and the Third Reich, the Nazi connection. No one has ever proved that definitively that the spacecraft or craft that was found at Roswell came from another world. I had the experience of listening to my own uncle talk about his attempts to work on this debris at Wright Field, and General Arthur Exon, who was the commandant of Wright Field for many years, also told me things that that led to the publication of my book, Majestic. And General Exon said to me, within 24 hours of our finding it, everyone from Truman on down knew that what we found was not of this world. But is that really true? Well, Joseph Farrell has perhaps a different idea. Joseph